say is that my dog ate my Cleopatra book.
Ah!
You see that? So when your students tell you your dog eats their homework, it turns out that they actually do things like this. New experience for me. All right, first I just want to, even though none of them are in the room, I want to acknowledge my students in my Cleopatra class this semester because they have such a brilliant group this time that they have really opened my eyes to thinking about these things in different ways, which has been extremely helpful as you're in the progress of a project this big. All right, it would probably be a challenge to find any person in the Western world, and perhaps in the Eastern world as well, who has not heard of Cleopatra. Everyone can tell you something. She was beautiful, she was learned, she wore thick black eyeliner. In fact, recently my daughter, who is 11 years old and cognitively impaired, told me, I said, do you know about Cleopatra? She said, yes. She was a witch and she's surrounded by mummies. And the source of that turns out to be Scooby-Doo meets Cleopatra, one I had not known about. Cleopatra has been molded, finessed. She's been sculpted and idealized. She's been turned white. She's been turned black. She's been depicted as a gypsy, a whore, a killer, and a witch. No one can ever get enough of Cleopatra. By my latest count, as of Amazon last night, there are 12 new books on Cleopatra in the past year. And I was actually going to drag them all up here and stack them up, but it was raining, so. Unlike most scholarly monographs, books on Cleopatra sell, go into paperback run, and even make the bestseller list recently. As an enduring icon of popularity, Cleopatra is unrivaled. But what do we really know about Cleopatra? A number of pieces of scholarship over the past decade or two have attempted to strip Cleopatra of her Shakespearean drama and Hollywood theatricality. These authors have tried to desensationalize her story and reduce her narrative to the story of a power-hungry monarch rather than that of a degenerate Eastern seductress. But this, in my opinion, does not go far enough. Because we are all so taken with Cleopatra, we are quite reckless in our approach to her. Classicists are generally extremely cautious in their uses of ancient sources, sometimes to the point of saying that we can confirm almost nothing about a particular topic. But when it comes to Cleopatra, we throw caution to the wind. So today, my talk will really not be about Cleopatra, sorry about that, but instead, I'm going to be talking about Plutarch, a plain old boring Greek guy, who is at the heart of our obsession about Cleopatra. I might even say that our obsession is his fault. Sources on Cleopatra from the ancient world are few and far between. Cleopatra herself, the ruler of a wealthy empire spread across the Mediterranean, engaged in active self-promotion, portraying herself in Egyptian art as a living deity, appearing in public in the guise of the goddess Isis, and staging elaborate ceremonies to promote herself. The attention she garnered made her the easy victim of the propaganda of her enemy, Octavian. Thus, Cleopatra became a character in Roman poetry. She is called by Propertius Regina Meretrix, the whore queen, and Horace calls her the Regina Dementis, the demented queen. Contemporary prose authors avoided any discussion of Cleopatra, except where Cicero wrote Regnam Odi, I hate the queen, which we would, of course, expect from Cicero. We do not have any Augustan historian's account of Octavian's conflict with Egypt, and this is probably no loss if we are interested in unbiased accounts. The poets Horace and Virgil give Cleopatra some credit for gumption. Virgil, in essence, concedes that she was a dux, a leader, but within the realm of fiction, they were able to accomplish this while keeping their heads. Thus, the real history of Cleopatra begins with Plutarch. Plutarch was a wealthy and well-educated Greek born in 44 of the Common Era. He was a prolific writer of a variety of essays and biographies, most of which focus on morality or ethics in some way or another. Plutarch's Lives, his most famous works, are not biographies in the modern sense, and certainly are not history. Plutarch himself was very clear on this, writing in his Life of Alexander, quote, "For it is not histories that I am writing, but lives." It is Plutarch's intention to show the events that best illustrate the moral fiber of his subject, rather than what would conventionally be considered their most famous deeds. Plutarch believed that narrative history was for those involved in the process, that is to say politicians, or at least people who wanted to learn from the mistakes of others. His own interest was in the individual characteristics of the figures he wrote about, not politics as a whole. Plutarch's primary interest was in men of great character, the Alexander the Greats and the Julius Caesars, who, while not perfect people, achieved greatness through strength of character. But Plutarch likewise felt a need to address those who fell short, preferably in a disastrous way. Plutarch chose 4 people to exemplify the effect bad character had on a man who had the potential to be great. He paired 2 traitors, Alcibiades the Athenian, with Coriolanus, the legendary Roman. Mark Antony was paired with Demetrius Poliorcetes, a Macedonian king who, after being successful early in his life, eventually lost his father's kingdom and died drunk in captivity. The parallels of events in the life of Antony and Demetrius, as described by Plutarch, are strikingly similar. Plutarch's Life of Antony, which many scholars consider his most impressive biography, was written somewhere between 110 and 115 Common Era, late in his life, as part of a group of Roman lives that included other prominent figures from the end of the Roman Republic, such as Julius Caesar, Brutus, and Pompey. By writing on these figures at one time, Plutarch was clearly trying to get a handle on the interaction of prominent individuals at a time when politics was so driven by personality. From the outset, Plutarch sets Antony up as a person who has sold out his potential greatness with a series of bad choices brought on by a flawed personality. Plutarch pins the decline of Antony on a number of vices, including drinking, womanizing, and generally keeping bad company. The historicity of these exploits is quite questionable, as Plutarch's source appears to be Cicero, Antony's sworn enemy. The stories are also scandalous. For example, Plutarch repeats Cicero's tale of Antony vomiting away his hangover into his toga while standing in the forum. Someone made a good laughing noise, that was good. I love the image of him holding out his toga and puking in it. In the context of today's talk, I can't get into all of the details of the life of Antony. Some observations, though, should be noted. One is that it is very difficult to separate the historical Antony from the exemplar of foolish behavior, in part because of Plutarch's questionable choice of sources. Also, in his conclusion, in which he briefly compares the lives of Antony and Demetrius, Plutarch molds his characters around his argument so as to have points of comparison and difference between the two, a clear case of the tail wagging the dog. Antony, in particular, is compared to mythological characters. Plutarch, as he tells us from the outset, is teaching us a lesson. He is not teaching us history. The Cleopatra of the Life of Antony is our earliest extant prose source on Cleopatra. She first appears in chapter 25 of the 87-chapter-long life and dominates from chapter 62 onward. In fact, she remains in the biography of Antony well after Antony is dead. The story, however, remains focused on Antony. The queen is, as far as Plutarch is concerned, the worst of Antony's bad habits. And here I quote from section 25. Such then was the nature of Antony, where now, as a crowning evil, his love for Cleopatra supervened, roused and drove to frenzy many of the passions that were still hidden and quiescent in him, and dissipated and destroyed whatever good and saving qualities still offered resistance. As bad habits go, Cleopatra was certainly a colorful one. Her story is told in great detail. Most of the tales are stock lore, tropes of excessive indulgence in luxury and leisure that reinforce the otherness of Cleopatra in both gender and, I don't know if you want to call it race or Easternness. While Plutarch believed that Cleopatra provided the slippery slope for Antony's moral decline, he does not pin the blame entirely on her. Antony, from his youth, engaged in foolish behavior, often acting in a base manner with his soldiers, drinking too much, and picking the wrong friends. Plutarch also finds fault with Antony's second wife, Fulvia, who in Plutarch's opinion had already set Antony on a path to ruin. Indeed, he says, and this is section 10, Cleopatra was indebted to Fulvia for teaching Antony to endure a woman's sway. Antony, as was obvious to any Roman or Roman sympathizer like Plutarch, was not being the man that he could have been. Fulvia, about whom the sources are nearly silent, because for some reason she was no Cleopatra, pushed Antony toward his final emasculation at the court of Cleopatra. In this way, Plutarch treats the Antony and Cleopatra affair exactly the same way that the poets do. Cleopatra is too powerful and too seductive, and Antony becomes a eunuch in her presence. In this, Antony's downfall is easily explained by shifting the gender roles in a way that is not only contrary to his Romanitas, but to nature itself. Hence the constant references to eunuchs, considered by the Romans to be the ultimate non-normative others. While Cleopatra is clearly depicted as the cause of Antony's ruin, at the same time, Plutarch manages to compose a hagiographically oriented narrative. Obviously, like so many others before and after him, Plutarch was fascinated with the already mythologized character of Cleopatra, a character created in part by Cleopatra. He in fact manages to squeeze nearly every anecdote about her into the biography. We learn of only a few of other ones from other authors. Because of this, the life of Antony really becomes the life of Antony and Cleopatra, or one could argue, the life of Cleopatra. And recently I found a website, it was a tourism website for Egypt, where it says that Plutarch visited Egypt and wrote a biography of Cleopatra. And that's true, actually. I don't know about the visiting, I mean, we think he visited Egypt. A critical question to ask is what Plutarch's sources were for his coverage of Cleopatra. There is no reason to think that Plutarch was familiar with Augustan poetry. Indeed, scholars question whether his Latin was sufficient for him to understand prose authors without assistance. Of course, there wasn't much of a historical tradition in Latin anyway. The Greek language historians of Roman history might have been his sources, but they preserve less information on Cleopatra than Plutarch does. Obviously, he may have drawn on written sources that are no longer extant, and we certainly know this from some of the other biographies. Therefore, oral tradition must have played an extensive role as a source for Plutarch, and he himself admits this. And I'm going to read to you my favorite passage here. Okay. Now, he's talking about Cleopatra and some stories he knows about her. He says, at any rate, Philotas, the physician of Amphissa, used to tell my grandfather, Lamprias, that he was in Alexandria at this time, studying his profession, learning to be a doctor, and that having gotten well acquainted with one of the royal cooks, he was easily persuaded by him to take a view of the extravagant preparations for a royal supper. Okay, so what is Plutarch telling us here? He says that he is repeating stories that his grandfather heard from some guy who knew someone who worked in Cleopatra's kitchen 100 years ago. Okay, now, when we are given a source like that, obviously we need to be rather cautious. And I probably shouldn't have to say that to anyone who knows anything about using ancient sources. If you ask any ancient historian worth their salt, they will tell you that Plutarch can be used as a source only with extreme caution. And as I'm saying that, I'm hearing my own mentor in graduate school saying that to me. Extreme caution when you use Plutarch. Okay? So So if someone's studying Alexander the Great, they say, oh, well, there's the Plutarch biography, but we don't believe any of that. Okay. But this is not the case with Cleopatra. The ongoing fascination with Cleopatra forces scholars and the public alike to be so completely desperate for information about her that they will throw caution to the wind and use sources that the same scholars would reject for any other historical figure. The prevailing attitude seems to have been, and continues to be, we will take anything we can get. Okay, so now we have my dog-eaten book. Okay, this is a book, it's about 7 or 8 years old. It is called Cleopatra Beyond the Myth. Beyond the Myth. By Michel Chabot, who is a Hellenistic historian. And he says in his book, what he wants to do is to get rid of all the mythologizing. Okay, so he says in his introduction, still, the evocative richness of the rare anecdotes concerning her have gone far to compensate for the lack of a continuous narrative. But this is even better. Okay, he's talking about the education of women in Hellenistic Egypt. He says, in the case of Cleopatra, the remarkable intelligence with which the ancient writers unanimously credit her was surely due to her innate ability. But the charm of her conversation and the refinement of her manners could have resulted only from a meticulous education. That's scholarship? I mean, you know, I'm almost glad you already the book. Okay. So the problem, though, it goes much deeper than this. Some scholars are a little bit more cautious in giving credence to the stories told by Plutarch and others. They recognize that cute anecdotes are just that. They're fine for Shakespearean tragedy, but they should not find their way into books on ancient history. What these historians fail to see, though, is that the meta-narrative of their work is still based firmly on that of Plutarch. The primary framework onto which Plutarch hangs his story of Cleopatra is one of decline and fall. Antony's failure to succeed in some type of lasting accord with Octavian can be seen by Plutarch only as a decline. The impetus for the decline is the queen, and the nature of the decline is moral. And this is exactly what Plutarch tells us he's going to write. But modern historians don't challenge this framework. They don't analyze Antony's story as a function of politics, economics, or socioeconomic factors. While some, or few, have learned not to repeat the tabloid-like stories of Cleopatra, they still treat her as the cause of the fall of a great man. This, I believe, has kept scholarship from approaching the subject of Cleopatra in any critical way that might bring us closer to an understanding of this period. The queen suffers doubly in historical analysis because she is actually depicted as having brought on the decline not only of Antony, but of her entire royal line. Perhaps never in recorded history has the need to talk or to say something caused a deeper hardening of the intellectual arteries than the ongoing discussion of a, quote, historical account of the events surrounding the Roman civil war between Octavian and Antony. My paper today is focused on how a deliberate fiction, Plutarch's Cleopatra, creates and distorts a reality to the point where even the most astute scholar is no longer aware. But I do believe there is a future for Cleopatra studies. The character of the queen needs to be thoroughly analyzed in the context of Plutarch's writings. There is a need for a reevaluation of the translations of Plutarch, on which most scholars are still dependent. And obviously the sexist language there is quite appalling. Work needs to be done on Plutarch's attitude towards Egypt and women in order to analyze Cleopatra. And then perhaps we at least will understand how Plutarch understood Cleopatra. Although they are less influential, other ancient authors who include the queen in their narrative must also be analyzed. We know that the character of Cleopatra is presented under the influence of Augustan propaganda, but we must come to understand the extent to which her character is a trope, a woman who seduces a weak man and leads him to ruin. In conclusion, Plutarch's version of the life of Cleopatra has been enormously influential since it was originally written. It is the basis for much of the myth that grew up around her character. But in reality, it is nearly as fictional as the Hollywood movies and should never act as the basis for the writing of history, no matter how desperate we are to know more. As difficult as it may be for all of us, we may have to accept that we will never know very much about Cleopatra.
Now we have about 5 minutes for questions or comments.
I did just finish Stephanie Schiff's Cleopatra of Life, and it seemed to me that she went back and forth on this issue. She presented that you couldn't use these sources, and then she used them.
That's exactly the problem. Now that book, of course, to me is just, it's laughable because there's not a thing in that book that has not been said in 10 other books, but she has a good agent. So she's all over Oprah and Larry King, and I mean, that book made it to the top of the bestseller list for a short time. And there's nothing in it that has not been said elsewhere. Although I do like the cover illustration because the hairdo is very good. No, the hairdo follows the way ancients depicted Cleopatra's hair. But aside from that,
Well, you answered my question.
yeah. This is the problem. There is not a single book on Cleopatra, whether it's written by a scholar or a popularizer, that doesn't do this thing, which is follow Plutarch to the letter. And I can't do it in 20 minutes, but I've actually sort of outlined every book on Cleopatra, and I have Plutarch's narrative outlined, and they're matches. Don?
You refer to a lot of classic sources of information for what we know about Cleopatra. Is there any hope for any sort of discovery of other information in any other tradition or culture that might?
There is, and I cut that part out because Roz was waving at me, but the only hope we have of really learning more about Cleopatra is to make more people learn Demotic Egyptian, because there are thousands and thousands of untranslated Demotic documents, which may well talk about her administrative skills and how she ran her kingdom rather than who she slept with, which I'm sure was of no interest to the Egyptians at all. But that'll be several more lifetimes of people. I mean, in any generation of scholars, there are maybe 3 or 4 in the world who know Demotic Egyptian, and that's it.
Let me ask you a provocative question. Given this problematic nature of this, why would you tackle this? I mean, provocative.
You know, I started, because I like being provocative, I started doing this because, honestly, we were thinking of new courses that we thought would serve our students well. And one of the things we want to teach in classics is how classics transforms in the Western tradition. And we thought, oh, Cleopatra, that would be a cool thing to do. So I started reading, and really became horrified by the quality of what passed for scholarship on Cleopatra. And the thing is, it doesn't take much. I mean, my students who are undergraduates, not all of them even majors, read these books and they go, what? That sounds like a pile of garbage. But the books keep coming and coming and coming. And I think someone needs to kind of just stop and say, I mean, I know it's sort of a negative result, but I think somebody has to say, stop. Stop writing books that are simply called Cleopatra. Let's acknowledge what we know and what we don't know. And the thing is, there's an enormous amount of value in studying how gender is viewed in these cases. But frankly, the more interesting thing about Cleopatra is her evolution over the past 2,000 years. That is a topic of much more interest, because that you can actually get your hands on. You know, my students yesterday, we were reading on Pushkin, you know, where she's a killer. She poisons people, or she has sex with them and then kills them. That's the price of having sex with her. This stuff is fantastic, you know. But this Cleopatra, this real Cleopatra, we don't know any Cleopatra. Why do I want to be perfect? Thank you. Thanks.